Do not leave university with a degree level knowledge of engineering or whatever it is and still a Sunday school knowledge of your God. Let me lead us in a prayer as we stand. Lord Jesus, thank you that you died to be able to forgive us whenever we fail you. And knowing that we often fail you under the pressure of the world around us, please make us wise through your word this evening to live for you in a non-Christian place. In Jesus' name, amen. Please do have a seat. And if you're a new student, I wonder what kind of first week or so you've had. I remember asking a new student that at the back of a welcome service like this, and he said, it's been a bit of a checkered one, actually. I set the hall kitchen alight, and the fire brigade had to come. So I said, what were you doing? And he said, cooking pasta. And I said, did you let it boil dry? And he said, no, I didn't know you had to put water in it in the first place. And I thought, how do you get to be 18 without knowing that? How do you get to university without knowing that? My memory of my own Freshers' Week is that I couldn't wait for it to be over, not because I'm unsocial, but because all the events had three ingredients which made socializing impossible. One was such loud music that you couldn't hear what anyone was saying. Another was so much free alcohol that what they were saying was incoherent anyway. And the other was the pressure to jump into bed with people, which is the worst possible way to try and get to know people. And those ingredients haven't changed, they've just become more in your face. For example, no one was committing the disgrace of handing out free condoms in my day. And the irony is, everyone says, it's great to go away to university because you get away from parents and teachers telling you what to do and you can just be independent. And then every new generation of students instantly surrenders their independence to the peer pressure of Freshers' Week. And I don't sit in judgment on that because I remember what it is like to be uprooted and transplanted into a place where you don't know anyone and everything in you just wants to fit in and make friends. So my question in preparing this was, what part of the Bible speaks to that situation? And my answer is Daniel chapter 1. Because if you're a student, Daniel was about your age. He had been uprooted from a home environment shaped by the Bible, and he'd been transplanted in the exile to Babylon, which in our terms was the most out-and-out non-Christian place that had ever hit him. So we're going to ask Daniel chapter 1 to answer the question, how can I make a wise start or restart in student life? And the rest of us who are not students can just translate the answer for our own situation. So could you turn in the Bibles to page 737? It's up there in the screens, floating in the River Tyne. Page 737, that will get you back to Daniel chapter 1, which says 4 things about living wisely in a non-Christian world. And the first is this: trust that Jesus is Lord, even when it doesn't look like it. So have a look at Daniel chapter 1, verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord, that's God, gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God, in other words, the temple. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, in other words, Babylon, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So up on the screens, we're in the Old Testament, before Jesus on the timeline. God's people were living in Judah, but they had been so unfaithful to God that he'd let this king Nebuchadnezzar invade them and take many of them into exile, including Daniel up there. And in the Pergamum Museum in Berlin, I've seen one of the gates of Babylon, which Daniel would have seen probably most days in his life there. Because it wasn't just the Brits who went around nicking things like the Elgin marbles. German archaeologists did the same, including bagging the entire front gate of the city of Babylon. So here it is. It is this huge gate with walls coming out along a processional way, longer than this building, in this vast museum. All along the walls, there are these lion figures trotting out from the city, and the message is clear: we're coming to get you. And Daniel had been got. So look at verse 2 again. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God, in other words, things from the Lord's temple in Jerusalem. And Nebuchadnezzar brought them to the land of Shinar, Babylon, to the house of his God, and placed those vessels in the treasury of his God. And bringing things from the Lord's temple and sticking them in his own God's temple was Nebuchadnezzar's way of saying, my God has won, and so yours must be either weak or false. And Daniel would have looked over here at the pathetic minority of believers like himself, and over here at the Babylonian majority who believed nothing of the God of the Bible and yet looked unbelievably successful. And he would have been tempted to think, God really did look discredited. And we will be tempted to think the same. So I remember one first year to me saying later in this equivalent term a few years ago, he said, it's not the temptations of sex and drink that I found the hardest thing. He said, it's been being surrounded by people who live as if Jesus wasn't there, and yet they look incredibly successful and like they're enjoying life more than I am. In other words, atheism looks like it's won, and Christianity looks either weak or false. Well, look back to the start of verse 2. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hands. So that is a reminder that it was God who let the exile happen as a judgment on his people's unfaithfulness. And in the same way, the decline of the church in Britain is also a judgment on its unfaithfulness. And that is why Christianity in our culture has shrunk. It's not because the gospel is untrue, it's because much of the church has been untrue to the gospel. And anyway, we need to remind ourselves that numbers are not the measure of who actually has the truth. So yes, the majority of people that you and I rub shoulders with tomorrow do not believe in Jesus, but that doesn't alter the facts that Jesus really lived, that he really died on the cross for our forgiveness, that he really rose from the dead and left behind an empty tomb in Jerusalem to show that he is the rightful Lord of everyone and the judge that we're all going to meet. And because those things really happened, that's the nature of things in history, they're true for everyone. And they remain true whether 95% of people around us or 5% of people around us believe it. The difference is that if it's only 5%, then you and I have got to be a whole lot more convinced about why we believe the gospel is true if we're going to be confident and upfront about it. And if you're a student and you do settle here as your church, one of the things I hope and think you'll find is space and help to grow into your own convictions. Because whether you would call yourself a Christian already, or you'd say, I'm really just still thinking about it, processing a Christian background, you need to grow into your own convictions. No one can believe for you. And only if you do that will you trust that Jesus is Lord, even when it doesn't look like it. That's the first thing Daniel 1 says to us. The second is this: be aware that the world is out to make you conform. Look on to verse 3. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans, i.e. Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. So that was the equivalent for Daniel of starting at Newcastle or Northumbria. And you can see the similarities. For example, in verse 3, there is the nobility. So that would be the really well-off public school guys and girls who clog up Jesmond every year with their Golf GTIs and keep little Waitrose going, coining it in. In fact, one article I saw said that Newcastle is the top university choice for old Etonians, quote, because it is ideally placed between the grouse shooting of Yorkshire and the salmon fishing of Scotland. And I'm sure you took that into account when you applied here, or at least you're presently surprised to discover that that's on offer. Then in verse 4, there's the similarity that Daniel had been vetted for knowledge and learning. He'd done UCAS, he'd got his grades. And then in verse 5, the most obvious similarity, they were to be educated for 3 years. But Nebuchadnezzar was not paying their tuition fees out of the kindness of his heart. His aim was to conform them, to turn them into Babylonians who would be docile, loyal yes men for his civil service. And Babylon in the Bible stands for the whole non-Christian world, and we need to be aware that it is out to make us conform. How? Well, look again at the end of verse 4. Nebuchadnezzar commanded his staff to teach Daniel and co. the literature and language. So take language. It is such a powerful tool for making people conform, isn't it? Because it carries whole ideologies. That's the whole thing about political correctness. So just think of the ideologies behind these examples of language. Partner, as opposed to husband or wife. Unwanted pregnancy, as opposed to unborn human being. Inappropriate, as opposed to wrong. Assisted dying, as opposed to killing. Gender identity, which we've just invented, as opposed to gender. Male or female. And by trying to make us use its language, the culture is out to conform us to its ideology. So there's language, then verse 5, there's the literature. And for us today, that wouldn't just include books and what comes at you through our highly politicized education system, but everything out there in the electronic and print media, TV, films, the internet, social media, all such powerful tools for making people conform. For example, how many people are conformed, perhaps by a single noddy science textbook, into believing that evolution is fact rather than theory? Or how many people doing art subjects are conformed into all the isms, relativism, feminism, postmodernism, existentialism, without even realizing that's what a writer or a lecturer is out to do? So language and literature make people conform. So do the far less subtle tools of manipulation like Freshers' Week and sports team initiation drinking games. But there's one other L that Nebuchadnezzar used, and that's luxury, or if you prefer, living standard. Look at verse 5. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. Do you know how much Her Majesty spent on food for entertaining last year? £1.4 million, with bottles of wine often £60 a bottle. That is the kind of thing Daniel was getting. And that is a dream standard of living, isn't it, compared to what they're giving you at Castle Leazes? Or compared to self-catering pasta and the odd eat as much as you like for £5 blowout in Chinatown. But the danger is we will conform to get or protect our standard of living. I heard a talk last week by the journalist Peter Hitchens, who is an atheist become professing Christian, and he said Britain is now worryingly like the Soviet Union, where he worked as a correspondent for many years. Because a kind of state atheism and morality is being imposed by law, by government. And he said in this talk, they don't make us conform by threatening our lives, old-fashioned Soviet style. They do it by threatening our livelihoods, our jobs, our standard of living. He said this, quote, "It's particularly clear to those who work in the public sector that there is no job security and no advancement if you will not conform, especially to the Equality Act, which is the new morality being imposed on us." So whether you're studying to get a job or already in one, Christians need to know you may have to lose jobs to remain faithful to Jesus. So that's the second thing. Be aware that the world is out to make you conform. It does not want you to remind it that Jesus is Lord, so it will make you live as if he isn't. That's what it's out to do, 24/7. So how do we avoid that? Do we retreat from the world and just live in a bubble with other Christians? Well, like Fee said earlier, no. Because the third thing Daniel says is this: be stuck into the world, but draw the line to show who owns you. Look on to verse 8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore, he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to. So he didn't say to himself, I can't possibly live for God in this ungodly environment. He said to himself, I can if I draw the line to show who owns me. Now, it's not clear why he drew this particular line. Some say it was because any meat would have been non-kosher and therefore against God's Old Testament law. But later in the book, he does seem to eat their meat, and anyway, God's law didn't rule out wine. So others say it was because the meat would have been dedicated to false gods, just like Muslims dedicate halal meat to Allah during the slaughter. You do realize that's what halal meat is. But probably the same would have applied to vegetables, and anyway, that's not explicitly said. What is explicitly said is that Daniel and co were being groomed to be yes men for the king. Look at verse 5 again. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years, and at the end of that time they were to stand before the king, which was jargon for be in his service. And in that culture, eating the king's food and wine was a sign of ultimate allegiance to him, and that's why Daniel drew the line. He saw that having the king's food and wine would defile him in the sense of signifying belonging to the king, giving ultimate allegiance to the king, whereas the opposite of defiled in the Old Testament is holy, which means set apart for God, belonging to God, giving your ultimate allegiance to him. And so Daniel draws the line between those two things so as to say, I'll serve the king, but the king will never own me. Now, clearly, there are some lines we must draw because otherwise we're going to be going outside God's will. For example, the Bible is perfectly clear that we must not get drunk or anywhere on the road towards it. So we've got to draw the line with alcohol very early on. But even when something is within God's will, it may be best to draw a line and not to do it in order to say, at least to ourselves, my ultimate allegiance is to Jesus. So, for example, a Christian friend of mine called Alistair played rugby for the Cambridge University rugby team, and in post-match bar sessions, they would always try to get Al to overdrink. And he had a policy of 1 pint and then stop. But his teammates were always baiting him, and Al said the message was always something like this: look, Al, we can tell that you really want to drink like the rest of us because you always have a bit. And it's just your weird Christian scruples that are holding you back. And so what did Al do? He went teetotal whenever he was with them. And he just drank Ribena and lemonade. And forever after, he became nicknamed the Ribena boy. He drew the line to make it absolutely clear where his ultimate allegiance lay. Because he did not want to look like someone who really wanted to get hammered with the rest of them. But my Christian scruples hold me back. He wanted to look like someone who belonged to Jesus lock, stock, and barrel, unashamedly. So be stuck into the world, but draw the line to show who owns you. The longer you leave it to do that, the harder it gets. Do it early. And if you've failed to, if you've messed up even this past Freshers week, which the majority of you probably have in some way, take that to Jesus, who died to forgive you everything you'll ever need forgiving. Ask his forgiveness. Get going again this week. Drawing the line obviously always carries the risk of how people will react. For example, if you won't do the initiation drinking game, then the risk is they might not have you in the team, pathetic as that is. For Daniel, it was the risk of Nebuchadnezzar getting wind of his stand, seeing it as disloyalty and executing him, which the rest of the book shows he was perfectly capable of doing to people he didn't like. And verses 9 to 15 describe how, instead of giving in to fear on that score, Daniel trusted the risk to the Lord, and the Lord upheld him in that stand. For time's sake, I'm not going to take us through those verses. We're going to skip to a final lesson, which is this: grow in wisdom from God so that you can influence the world for him. Look down to verse 17 to end. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. At the end of the time, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they stood before the king, in other words, entered his service, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. Isn't that striking? They get this Babylonian indoctrination supposedly to bring them up to speed with all the Babylonians, and they end up outstripping them completely, verse 20, in every matter of wisdom and understanding. Why? Verse 17 again. As for these 4 youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. So they outstrip the rest in wisdom because they know the one true God. And wisdom, in other words, the ability to see and do what is right or best in life, does come from God. So if you know God through Jesus, that is a priceless privilege that you have over other people. Because in trusting his will as revealed in the Bible, you have wisdom, they don't. So, for example, while they are in the dark about how God intended sex to be used and misusing it to their harm, you have the privilege of being in the light, of knowing God's design and being able to live by trust in that rather than by experiment, which just messes you more and more up in the process. Now, between us, we have all made plenty of mistakes in the area I've just mentioned, and 1,001 others. Christians ongoingly fail to live within God's will, for which, as I said a moment ago, there is ongoing forgiveness. But it is a priceless privilege to have God's wisdom to guide and to guard us, and especially if you have had that from the word go in a Christian home. Please do not let the world tell you or make you think that's been a straitjacket and you've been missing out. It is the unbelieving world that is missing out on the life that God meant us to live, however much it projects the image of having fun. And all of that is why, whatever else you do, the thing God wants you to do while you're here at university is to grow in knowledge of him and wisdom from him so that you can influence the world for him, which is what Daniel did. He didn't just come out of his 3 years with a Babylonian combined studies degree. He came out with wisdom, having got to know God better than ever before, which is why if you are a Christian new to town, you need to find and settle quickly into a good church. I want to say Christian unions are helpful but optional. Being anchored in a church that will teach you the Bible well is essential for growing in your knowledge of God in a way that sets you up for life. Please, please, please do not leave university with a degree level knowledge of engineering or whatever it is and still a Sunday school knowledge of your God. That will not set you up for life. Daniel went on to influence both Nebuchadnezzar and his country because he grew like that. And this country desperately needs Christians who will do more than just come out of uni as good doctors, good teachers, good lawyers, and so on, and just quietly keep our heads down. This country needs Christians who will seek to influence medicine, education, the legal system, every other area of life for Christ, like John Wyatt, who's joining us next Sunday. But you will only do that if you start as Daniel did. You will only take a stand for Christ in the future if you start taking a stand for him now. And if you do end up having influence for him in 10, 20, 30, 40 years in a big way, it will be because you started having influence for him in small ways today. Let's pray. Father, we want to thank you for every student in Newcastle tonight, especially those who are new. We pray for those who don't yet know you, that during their time at uni, you would graciously give them the opportunity to hear about Jesus, or hear again if they've left him behind. And we pray for all of those who are already trusting in you and following you. And we think of guys and girls who've gone away from Cypher, who are starting at unis elsewhere. Please lead them to choose and settle into churches and not to drift without Christian support. Please give them and all of us the wisdom to see how we need to draw the line, and give us the faith to trust you in drawing those lines and taking stands with all the risks that they entail. Father, above all, help us to grow in knowledge of you so that we see the world for what it is, and so that we want you more. In Jesus' name, amen.